The sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting a golden glow across the tranquil river. The water was still, its surface reflecting the soft pink and orange hues of the dawn. A gentle mist rolled off the river, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and fresh water. It was the kind of morning that made you feel alive, the kind of morning that made you forget the chaos of the world. For Ethan Carter, this was his sanctuary. After 2 decades of service in the military, all he had ever wanted was peace. No more orders, no more rules, no more power struggles. Just the quiet solitude of nature. He had found it here, on a secluded piece of land along the river, nestled just outside the borders of an upscale housing development called Riverbend Estates. Ethan's property wasn't much, just a small, rustic house, a sturdy dock, and a fishing boat. But it was his. Every plank, every nail, every inch of that land belonged to him. He had bought it years ago, long before the manicured, cookie-cutter neighborhood had sprung up across the way. Back then, the area had been nothing but wilderness. Now it was a battleground. Ethan sat on his dock, a steaming cup of coffee in one hand and a fishing rod in the other. He watched as the sun crept over the treetops, casting long shadows across the riverbank. This was his favorite time of day. Here, he didn't have to answer to anyone. No commanders barking orders, no bureaucrats breathing down his neck. Just him, the river, and the occasional bald eagle swooping down for its breakfast. But that peace was short-lived. It started with a letter. Ethan found it in his mailbox one afternoon, stamped with an official-looking seal from the Riverbend Homeowners Association, HOA. At first, he assumed it was a mistake. His land had been privately owned for decades, long before the HOA even existed. He had never signed any agreements, never paid any dues, never attended their meetings. So, he ignored the letter. But the letters didn't stop. Then came the visitors. One morning, as Ethan was preparing to cast his line into the river, he heard the crunch of gravel under tires. He turned to see a sleek black SUV pulling up to his property. 3 people stepped out, 2 men and a woman. The woman was dressed in a sharp beige blazer, her blonde bob perfectly in place. She exuded an air of authority, the kind that made Ethan's skin crawl. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice dripping with artificial politeness. "I'm Karen Whitaker, president of the Riverbend Homeowners Association. These are my colleagues, Mr. Dunbar and Mr. Ellis. We're here to discuss some concerns regarding your property." Ethan arched an eyebrow. "Concerns?" Karen gestured toward his dock and boat. "We've received multiple complaints from residents about disruptions coming from your lot. Noise, unsightly structures, and most concerning, unauthorized fishing activities." Ethan let out a sharp laugh. "Unauthorized? This is my land, my dock, my boat. I'll fish whenever I damn well please." Dunbar, the man with the clipboard, cleared his throat. "Technically, Mr. Carter, this land is adjacent to Riverbend Estates, and as such, it should comply with the neighborhood's environmental and aesthetic guidelines." "Should," Ethan repeated, narrowing his eyes. "It doesn't, because it's not part of your damn HOA." Karen's fake smile never wavered. "We believe there's been a misunderstanding. This area has been designated for community preservation. Your fishing activities, along with the modifications you've made to the shoreline, are problematic. We're willing to work with you to bring everything up to standard." Ethan stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "Let me make something clear, Karen. My property isn't part of your little kingdom. I don't pay your fees, I don't follow your rules, and I sure as hell don't answer to you." Mr. Ellis, the man with the camera, finally spoke. "We're not here to start trouble. We're just here to document the violations." Ethan looked between the 3 of them. "Violations?" Dunbar lifted his clipboard. "Failure to adhere to HOA landscaping standards, unauthorized shoreline modifications, potential safety hazards regarding the dock structure, and of course, excessive and unregulated fishing." Ethan barked out a laugh. "Unregulated fishing? You people really think you own the damn river, don't you?" Karen's smile finally faltered. "This is a warning, Mr. Carter. We'd hate for this to escalate." Ethan took another step forward, his grip tightening around the handle of his fishing rod. "Escalate how exactly?" Dunbar shifted uncomfortably. Ellis's hand twitched near his camera again. Karen, however, didn't back down. Let's just say that we have ways of handling noncompliance. You might want to consider working with us. It would be easier for everyone involved. A threat. That's what this was, a thinly veiled, corporate speak, HOA-wrapped threat. Ethan smiled. Karen, he said slowly, enjoying the way her name tasted like venom on his tongue. You and your boys are trespassing. If you don't leave right now, I'll be forced to assume you're here to cause trouble. And I don't take kindly to troublemakers on my land. Karen's nostrils flared, but she didn't move. Neither did her goons. So, Ethan took another step forward, this time raising his fishing rod slightly, just enough to make it clear that he was done playing their little games. Leave, he said. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Karen let out a sharp breath through her nose and motioned to her lackeys. This isn't over, she said, turning on her heel. Ethan watched them march back to their expensive SUV, Dunbar furiously scribbling notes while Ellis snapped a few more pictures. The tires kicked up dust as they sped away, but Ethan knew this wasn't the last he'd see of them. No, this was just the beginning. The real fight was coming, and they had no idea what kind of war they were about to start. At first, Ethan thought maybe he was being paranoid. A simple mistake, a coincidence. But as the days passed, it became obvious. This wasn't paranoia. This was war. The first sign was his dock. He woke up one morning, coffee in hand, ready to cast his line into the river when he noticed something was off. One of the wooden planks was loose, nearly pried from its place. It wasn't weathered or worn down. It had been tampered with. Someone had been out there in the night, trying to make it look like an accident waiting to happen. A step in the wrong place, and Ethan could have fallen straight into the water. Then, a few days later, his boat was untied. Not drifting, not nudged by the current, completely unmoved. The knots he tied every damn day weren't loose. Someone had undone them. If he hadn't noticed in time, the boat would have been carried downriver, maybe even lost for good. Ethan installed cameras that very night, but that wasn't enough for them. The next morning, he found broken glass scattered along the riverbank, right where he usually waded into the water. Not a bottle accidentally left behind, shards deliberately placed, hidden beneath the mud. If he had walked barefoot, he would have torn up his feet. He checked the footage from his cameras. A shadowy figure, tall and broad-shouldered, creeping along his fence line in the dead of night. The quality wasn't great, but Ethan recognized the build, one of Karen's lackeys. That night, Ethan stayed awake, armed and ready. He watched and waited, and when he finally heard the rustling near his dock around 2 a.m., he didn't hesitate. He stepped outside, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. Two figures froze in the beam of light, HOA patrol. Their hands hovered near his dock, caught in the act. Looks like I found some trespassers, Ethan said, his voice low and dangerous. They bolted, but Ethan wasn't about to let them off that easy. He knew they'd run straight back to Karen, and he was right. Less than 24 hours after he caught her goons sneaking around his dock, Ethan woke up to something much worse, police sirens outside his house. Ethan stepped onto his porch, shirtless and coffee in hand, as 3 squad cars pulled into his driveway. The sight of half a dozen officers climbing out, hands hovering near their belts, should have made his stomach sink. But he'd been through worse. He leaned against the railing, waiting for the circus act to begin. Then he saw her, Karen, standing beside one of the officers, arms crossed, face twisted into a self-satisfied smirk. "Mr. Carter," one of the cops called out, stepping forward. "We need to have a word." Ethan sighed, setting his coffee down on the porch railing. "What's the charge, officer?" The officer, a tall guy with a shaved head and a hardened look, pulled out a notepad. "We received multiple complaints about illegal activities on this property, namely, unlicensed commercial fishing, environmental violations, and—" He hesitated, like he didn't even believe the next part. "Possession of hazardous materials." Ethan blinked. Hazardous materials? Karen stepped forward then, holding a stack of papers like a damn lawyer in court. "That's right, officer. Mr. Carter has been engaging in unregulated fishing operations, which is a clear violation of the Clean Water Act. He has also been storing dangerous chemicals on site, which could pose a risk to the community." Ethan had to laugh. "And what exactly do you think I'm storing?" "Napalm." Karen ignored him. "Furthermore, the HOA has documented numerous complaints from concerned residents about late-night activities, loud noises, and suspicious behavior." That was rich, considering it was her people sneaking around in the dark. Ethan crossed his arms. This is private property. I don't answer to the HOA, and I sure as hell don't answer to Karen. Unless you have an actual warrant, I suggest you get off my land. The officer hesitated. He knew this was a waste of time. Karen, sensing she was losing ground, played her final card. Mr. Carter resisted HOA security last night, she said smoothly. 2 of our community patrolmen reported that he physically threatened them. That's assault. Ethan exhaled through his nose, trying to keep his temper in check. If he had actually assaulted them, they wouldn't have walked away. The officer's lips twitched. He knew Ethan was telling the truth, but procedure was procedure. Mr. Carter, he said, tucking away his notepad. I need you to come with us for some questioning. Ethan knew fighting it here wouldn't do him any favors, so he smirked at Karen, grabbed his jacket, and climbed into the squad car. If she thought this would scare him into submission, she was about to be very disappointed. The ride to the station was short and uneventful. They didn't cuff him because, deep down, the cops knew this was a farce. When they arrived, Ethan sat through the motions, basic questioning, a formality more than anything. They didn't have any real charges, just a stack of HOA complaints that meant nothing in a court of law. 2 hours later, Ethan walked out of the station without so much as a fine. Karen had wasted everyone's time, but that was never her goal. She wanted to make a statement, to show Ethan that she could make his life difficult. That's when Ethan decided to make a statement of his own. He drove straight home, still running hot from the interrogation, expecting at least a few days of quiet before the next round of HOA nonsense. He was wrong. By the time he turned onto the dirt road leading to his property, his headlights caught 3 figures standing near his dock. Even from a distance, he could see the gleam of flashlights and the reflective patches on their shoulders. HOA security. These weren't just Karen's little clipboard-carrying lapdogs. This was their so-called community patrol, the one she sent when she wanted to scare someone. Big mistake. Ethan killed the engine and stepped out of the truck, the crunch of gravel under his boots breaking the night silence. The moment the 3 men spotted him, they tensed up. One of them, a thick-necked bastard with a buzz cut, stepped forward like he was about to give orders. Evening, Mr. Carter. We're conducting a property compliance inspection. Ethan scoffed. You're trespassing. The second man, a wiry guy with shifty eyes, smirked. HOA regulations state that we have the right to conduct safety inspections on all neighborhood-adjacent properties. Ethan took a slow step forward, fists clenching at his sides. This isn't an HOA property. Buzzcut kept his ground. Maybe not officially, but let's not be difficult. We've had multiple complaints about this dock being a hazard. Might have to file an official report, have it condemned, which would mean you'd have to remove it. Shifty eyes finished for him. Now, we understand this isn't about intimidation anymore. They weren't just taking pictures, leaving notes, or making empty threats. They were here to tear his dock down. The third guy, a silent hulking figure standing behind them, had a crowbar in his hand. That was all the confirmation Ethan needed. His blood went hot. You touch that dock, he said slowly, dangerously, and you'll regret it. Buzzcut let out a condescending chuckle. Look, man, no need to get aggressive. We're just doing our job. You're already on thin ice after that stunt last night. Ethan took another step forward. Last warning. Get off my land. Shifty eyes reached for something at his belt. Maybe a radio, maybe something else. Ethan didn't wait to find out. He closed the distance in 2 strides, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against the nearest wooden post. The air left his lungs in a choked wheeze. Buzzcut moved fast, swinging at Ethan with a cheap sucker punch, but Ethan was faster. He ducked, driving his elbow into Buzzcut's ribs before smashing his fist into his jaw. Buzzcut stumbled back, cursing, hand going to his mouth. And then there was the big guy, crowbar in hand. He came at Ethan like a freight train. Ethan dodged left at the last second, but the big guy still clipped his shoulder, sending a jolt of pain down his arm. The guy was stronger than the other 2, but strength means nothing if you don't know how to use it. Ethan let him take another wild swing, watching his balance shift, then moved in, grabbing his wrist and twisting hard until the crowbar clattered to the ground. Before the big guy could react, Ethan drove his knee into his stomach, knocking the air out of him. The big guy collapsed to his knees, wheezing. Shifty Eyes was still coughing against the post. Buzzcut was spitting blood onto the dirt. And the big guy was down for the count. Ethan stepped back, breathing hard, flexing his sore shoulder. "Get up," he growled. "Get the hell out of here before I decide to call the real cops." Buzzcut wiped his mouth, glaring at Ethan. "You're making a mistake, man." Ethan picked up the crowbar the big guy had dropped and tossed it into the river. "The only mistake I made," he said, "was letting you walk away." They got the message. One by one, they staggered back toward their vehicle. Buzzcut hesitated at the door, locking eyes with Ethan one last time. "Karen's not going to let this go," he muttered. Ethan smirked. "Neither am I." The SUV's tires spun in the dirt as they peeled out of Ethan's driveway. He watched them go, heart still pounding in his chest. This was no longer just an HOA dispute. This was war, and Ethan was done playing defense. Ethan expected retaliation. Karen wasn't the type to lick her wounds and walk away. No, people like her escalate. And sure enough, she did. But this time, she didn't send her little patrol monkeys to vandalize his property or leave more empty threats. This time, she tried to steal his land. It started with a letter, an official-looking document, thick with legal jargon, delivered straight to his mailbox. Notice of property reevaluation. Ethan skimmed it. HOA boundary adjustments, jurisdictional expansion, terms like annexation and revised districting stood out like flashing neon signs. And at the bottom, in that smug, looping signature, Karen Whitaker, HOA president. Ethan clenched his jaw. He'd seen plenty of dirty tactics in his life, but this was next level. She was trying to rewrite the property lines, trying to legally absorb his land into HOA jurisdiction. If this scam went through, they'd have the right to fine him, regulate him, and eventually force him out. He took the papers inside, sat down at his desk, and started digging. The more he read, the angrier he got. The document cited community planning records that didn't exist, zoning laws that had never applied to his land, and most damning of all, a list of property owner signatures approving the change. His name was on that list. Forged. That was the final straw. Karen thought she could play this like a quiet legal battle. She thought she could drown him in paperwork and push him off his own damn land. She was about to regret underestimating him. Karen had crossed a line. Vandalism, harassment, and threats were one thing. Forgery and land theft? That was a whole different game, and Ethan was about to flip the damn board. Ethan wasted no time. The next morning, he drove straight to his lawyer's office. Michael Grant, an ex-prosecutor turned real estate and property rights bulldog, listened as Ethan laid everything out, the fake documents, the boundary fraud, the forged signatures, his included. By the time Ethan was done, Michael looked ready to tear someone apart. "This is criminal," he said, his eyes dark. "We're not just talking about a civil case here. This is fraud, forgery, and attempted property theft." "Damn right it is," Ethan muttered. "And I want her nailed to the wall for it." Within 48 hours, they filed a lawsuit against the HOA, backed by concrete evidence. Ethan documented everything, the fake complaints, the harassment, the security footage of Karen's lackeys sneaking onto his land. But the real bombshell? Michael got a forensic analyst to examine the forged signatures. The verdict? Undeniable fraud. That was all the authorities needed. When the sheriff's department showed up at Karen's door with an arrest warrant, half the damn neighborhood gathered to watch. She screeched and protested, but the evidence was overwhelming. Forgery, fraud, attempted property seizure, trespassing. Her smug HOA empire collapsed in a single afternoon. As she was shoved into the back of a squad car, she turned and locked eyes with Ethan. "You think this is over?" she spat, her voice shaking. Ethan smirked. "For you? Yeah, it is." The day Karen was hauled off in cuffs, the war officially ended. But victory didn't come without scars. The HOA tried to distance themselves from her, pretending they had no idea what she was up to. But Michael wasn't about to let them off the hook. The lawsuit continued, and soon enough, the entire board was exposed for their corruption. Fines were issued. Board members resigned in disgrace. Riverbend Estates was forced to pay damages, and the HOA's power crumbled overnight. But even with them gone, the damage had been done. Ethan's dock had been vandalized. His property had been under siege for months. He barely slept for weeks, always waiting for the next move, the next attack. Even now, every time he heard a car slow down near his driveway, his muscles tensed out of habit. Freedom had a price. One afternoon, while fixing a broken section of his fence, one of his neighbors walked up. A guy Ethan barely knew, someone who'd kept his head down while Karen ran the show. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," the neighbor muttered. "A lot of us should have spoken up sooner." Ethan studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, you should have." The neighbor looked down, ashamed. But Ethan didn't need his apology. He didn't fight this war for thanks. He fought it because no one takes his land. That night, Ethan sat on his porch, beer in hand, staring out at the quiet river. For the first time in months, he wasn't waiting for the next battle. He had won. The land was his, always had been, always would be. And if anyone ever tried to take it from him again, they'd regret it. The river flowed on, as it always had, untouched by the petty squabbles of men. Ethan sat on his dock, fishing rod in hand, watching the sun rise over the treetops. The air was crisp, the scent of pine and fresh water filling his lungs. He had fought for this. He had bled for this. And now, as the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, he knew it had all been worth it. The land was his. The river was his. And no one, no HOA, no Karen Whitaker, no one, would ever take it from him. Ethan cast his line into the water, a small smile playing on his lips. The war was over. The river's edge was his, and he intended to enjoy it in peace. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.